Monday, DawgNation. My name is Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. As you might imagine, a lot of Demetris Robertson talking today's program. We got Chip Towers coming up a little bit later on that subject as well. Let me take care of one piece of video business off the top of our program. We've had a little bit of a finicky issue with YouTube here today. So if you're watching on Facebook, you should notice no difference in the program. If you're normally a YouTube viewer, hopefully we've got this resolved by the time you're checking us out. If not, you may want to hop on the DawgNation Facebook page to watch the show the way that you normally do, and hopefully by tomorrow we'll have the YouTube stuff taken care of. We do profusely apologize for the inconvenience there in that regard, but nonetheless, however you get to us, we're glad you're with us as DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, begins right now.
From DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
To be completely honest about something, it is really hard for anything around DawgNation to be, quote, underrated, just given the fact that there is so much attention paid to Georgia. Fans are starved for coverage for UGA. DawgNation providing massive coverage of every story to sort of feed that appetite for UGA fans. Every issue surrounding Georgia football by, the end point in time sort of gets talked to death to the point that really everything is either properly rated or maybe a tendency to sometimes overrate things. Nothing would seem to be ever even possible to be underrated, but the impossible may have indeed happened this weekend, because on Friday, you no doubt were thrilled with the news that the former five-star wide receiver, the freshman All-American at Cal, who made the decision to transfer to the University of Georgia, Demetris Robertson, was indeed ruled eligible by the NCAA. This is big news. DawgNation gave it big coverage. It was a big topic of conversation on the forum at forum.DawgNation.com. Many of you were reaching out to me on Twitter at DawgNation Daily to discuss it, and in kind of monitoring the conversation all weekend and participating with you over it, I've sort of come to a bit of a conclusion. Believe it or not, as big of a deal as this may seem with Demetris Robertson, I think the actual impact on UGA may even be greater than some Georgia fans are giving it credit for being. This may be bigger news than some Georgia fans even realize, and bigger news all for the better when it comes to UGA. And over the course of the next few minutes, I want to do my part to try to explain that to you. First of all, let me start with Kirby Smart here, who, upon the completion of Georgia's scrimmage on Saturday, the first of the summer series here for UGA, Smart spoke about the scrimmage, but the subject of Demetris Robertson was also a hot topic there that day, and Smart sort of talked about the process of how it was that Robertson became eligible by the NCAA on Friday afternoon. Here is Kirby.
I'm restrained in what I can really talk about the basis of the appeal, but as far as the process went for me, compliance had the waiver go in, and from that, the NCAA looked it over and sent back to us yesterday that he was granted the appeal, and he would be eligible to play immediately. And obviously, we're excited. I'm really excited for Demetris because he's a great kid, and he's blended in well with our team. The one thing about him I wasn't aware of is he's played with really good toughness. He's gone out and competed every day. He's probably not in the shape that our guys are, because our guys go through this summer running, conditioning, lifting. He didn't do that. Now, I know he worked out on his own, but it's never the same. So I'm really pleased with his work ethic, but his conditioning has got to improve to really be able to help us this season.
So he says the conditioning's got to improve, and you got to understand that not being with Scott Sinclair under his watchful eye and his tutoring, that's obviously going to make an impact on Demetris Robertson. But when the conditioning, when that sort of physicality does return for D-Rob, here's one place you can see him sort of make an impact. If you look at Georgia in comparison to recent national champions, and just for the subject of sake of conversation, let's keep this just to the college football playoff era. We've got 4 college football playoff national champions. That's a decent little sample size to kind of make some comparisons with. And there's one thing that you see that all those national champions have had that Georgia has not had, but maybe Demetris Robertson actually becomes the sort of missing piece there in that regard. UGA's leading receiver last year would have been Javon Wims, somewhere around, 720 yards, somewhere along that regard. Terry Godwin just below that. Riley Ridley probably a couple hundred yards below that. And that was essentially Georgia's leading receivers last year. But national champions always have a much higher sort of level of achievement than that. You go back and look at the 2017 Alabama team that wins the national championship. Riley Ridley has 967 yards receiving. Mike Williams for Clemson in 2016, he led the Tigers with 1,361 yards receiving. Riley Ridley for the 2015 Alabama national champion also went over 1,000 yards at 1,045 yards receiving. Even the Ohio State team that won the first college football playoff, a team that you don't really think of as throwing the ball all that much, even in that season, Devin Smith had more than 900 yards receiving, 931 yards receiving. So here's where I think that Demetris Robertson potentially has a way of really paying off for the University of Georgia here in 2018. And I think it actually makes Georgia a legitimate national championship contender because Robertson, I believe, becomes the most likely threat on the Georgia roster to become the thing that all national champions have had. As I just read to you, every national champion in the college football playoff era has had a receiver, at least one receiver, go over 900 yards receiving for the year. Georgia hasn't had that, but I believe that Demetris Robertson becomes the most likely option to do that for Georgia here in 2018. And for what it's worth, Kirby Smart also talked a little bit on Saturday about exactly how it was that Georgia would use Robertson now that he is a full go according to the NCAA. Here's a little more from Kirby.
He's a good wideout. I mean, he was a kid in high school that was a track guy. I remember he ran a lot of races against Nate McBride and Miko, and as I recruited those guys, they were always kind of the same track meets, kind of around the same area, and they were always there. So he's got good speed. He's bright. He's picked the offense up, but we just kind of let him go out there and play, and he's naturally picked things up really well. But, I'm going to be honest with you, there's a lot of competition in that receiver room. I mean, I know y'all got the five-star syndrome. There's a lot of guys out there that weren't five stars that are competing every day. And I'm proud of the way Demetris has competed. But there's guys out there, Jason Stanley and Tyler Simmons, to me, those two guys have worked their tail off. They were dominant special teams players last year. This year, they've really been good wideouts and special teams players. So there's going to be good competition in that room.
It's probably not surprising that Kirby Smart sort of pivots away from talking too much about D-Rob and giving some praise to a couple unheralded UGA wide receivers, Tyler Simmons, who, by the way, was still on sides in the national championship game. You hear Kirby Smart mention him there, also Jason Stanley as well. That's just sort of typical Kirby Smart to say, hey, I'm not going to go crazy obsessing over these five-star guys. I'm going to talk about the entire depth of our roster here and the competition that's going on. Nothing's going to be given to D-Rob, and that's certainly true. But it's also worth kind of keeping this in mind for Demetris Robertson and his status as a former five-star prospect coming out of high school. Georgia, because they get him as a transfer, has sort of already weathered the storm that would come the way of a lot of former five-stars in the same position. If you go back and look at the 24/7 Sports Composite, the year before D-Rob came out in 2016, because D-Rob was the only five-star receiver for his year of 2016. The year before that in 2015, there were 5 former five-star receivers. But a couple of those guys have made, virtually no impact to the college game whatsoever. Now, Christian Kirk's already become a first-round draft pick. Calvin Ridley's already become a first-round draft pick. Deion Kane was plenty good for Clemson. But George Campbell, Tyron Johnson, we haven't heard a lot from them yet. There is to be expected some attrition in terms of five-star guys moving from high school to college. But Georgia knows that Demetris Robertson's that sort of category of five-star receivers we know can play because we saw him become a freshman All-American at Cal in his only full season playing there in Berkeley in 2016. It's another reason why I think the impact of Demetris Robertson on UGA is going to be huge here, and I think that it could potentially be the kind of thing that really is that final missing piece of the Georgia offense that puts Georgia right there alongside the teams that are currently sort of ranked ahead of it in most of the preseason polls. Teams like Clemson and Alabama. Robertson may be the one missing piece that makes that ranking, seem incorrect by the time you get to the end of the season. But now even some Georgia fans will say, hold on now. Don't go praising Demetris Robertson too much at the expense of guys like Terry Godwin and McCole Hardman, wide receivers already on the roster. After all, we know what they can do at the SEC level because we saw them do it. For Godwin, it's been multiple years. For McCole Hardman, it was a full season there in 2016. We know they can handle the load that the SEC requires, and that is no doubt a question that Demetris Robertson is still going to have to face. After all, the Pac-12 is a very different brand of football. The numbers that Robertson puts up there, he does put up in an offense that just threw the ball a lot more than Georgia threw it last season. And that fact is also not lost on Kirby Smart, who said not only is the style of offense that Georgia plays different than what was used out there in Berkeley with the California Golden Bears, but the brand of defense you face in the SEC, that's really different too. Here's more of Kirby on that subject.
He's playing in the SEC now. There's guys just as fast as him out there. This league, you find out real quick when you get bump and run every down. When you play South Carolina, Kentucky, Florida, Auburn, they're going to bump and run you every down. So that's not exactly where he came from. The league he came where they're always pressed on him. So he's done a great job competing. I'm very pleased with where he is. I want him to continue to work, to develop, learn the offense, to help us every way he can.
So it is true. Going from the Pac-12 to the SEC, there's an exchange right there. It's just a different brand of football. The kinds of defenses he faces are going to be different as well. But to make too much of that would be to sort of disregard and disrespect the prodigious talent load that Demetris Robertson brings to the table. As I said before, he is somewhat of already a finished product of the wide receiver position. He's not an athlete that has to come here and be trained how to play. He already knows that position, and now it's simply a matter of figuring out how does he fit into what Georgia does. And my prediction is he's going to fit in very well. Go back and look at those 4 recent college football playoff national championship teams. All those teams had at least one receiver that could go over 900 yards and come close to eclipsing that 1,000-yard mark. That would seem to be an important part of national championships here in the modern age. Demetris Robertson could be that guy for UGA, and it could make a big postseason difference for the Dogs at the end of this year. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented by Marco's Pizza. Glad to have you with us. Whether you're watching us on video live every day at 10 on the DawgNation Facebook page. I also said we were having problems on YouTube this morning. As it turns out, I guess we're not. I guess we are on YouTube here today, so maybe a bit of a false alarm in that regard. So if you watch us at 10 on the DawgNation YouTube page, we appreciate that. DawgNation Twitter feed as well. We're live there at 10 a.m. each and every day. Radio at noon with our friends in the Classic City on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We love being on the radio in Athens. And, of course, we are available in podcast form, on demand, pretty much wherever podcasts can be found. We're just glad you have found DawgNation Daily here today, and we appreciate Marco's Pizza for making it all possible. And Marco's Pizza, they invite you to blitz your hunger with Marco's. You can get 2 medium, 2-topping pizzas right now for just $6.99 each. It's every store, every day, the Italian way. You can find them online at marcos.com, and you can enjoy a little Marco's Pizza here as you get settled in and are ready to enjoy the big week. Kind of a great way to do things on a Monday. After all, who feels like cooking on Monday? Why not let Marco's Pizza do the cooking for you, and you can get authentic Italian quality pizza there. That is really good stuff. All right, we're going to hear from Chip Towers here in a moment. I'm going to get his thoughts on Demetris Robertson, kind of how he fits into the scene for Georgia here this season, and maybe even how he compares to receivers that are already on the roster. Guys like Terry Godwin, guys like McCole Hardman, guys like Riley Ridley. I'm going to stand by my suggestion from earlier that if a Georgia receiver does come close to approaching 1,000 yards this year for me, it's more likely to be Robertson than any of the other trio that I just mentioned. You can weigh in on that as well, and we'll let Chip Towers do some of that too. Before we get into that, though, there's another issue on the Robertson front that I want to discuss here for a moment. I think it is really interesting how Kirby Smart chose to handle this from the word go. There was very little politicking on Kirby Smart's part. There was no, whether it be SEC Media Days or some of the summer speaking engagements, there was no fist on the table, pounding and banging, and sort of making his case for why he thought Demetris Robertson should be eligible. He didn't really lean on his status or his influence at all. He just simply let all this play out, and eventually it sort of worked out into his favor. It's almost sort of a cool and measured way in which Kirby Smart approached this. And on Saturday, he did talk a little bit more about what was going on behind the scenes, paying attention to some other recent, guys who've been ruled eligible. It sort of seems to suggest that maybe the NCAA is sort of softening its stance on some of this kind of stuff. Here's a little bit of Kirby on that point.
It was independent, and they decided that they were going to grant it. I mean, it is pretty obvious that they're granting more of them if you look across the board, and they seem more lenient when it comes to it. But like I said a while back, each case is independent of the previous, so they've got their reasoning for looking at it. I don't necessarily know that. It's not – I got a lot more pressing things to worry about. I can only go with what they decide and what they do, but it certainly looks to be that way.
Yeah, I think that Kirby Smart's right about this. Obviously, when you look at what happened at Florida with their 2 receivers ruled eligible, some other situations around the landscape of college football, it seemed like the arrow was pointing in a positive direction here for UGA. But also the NCAA has also got a really weird history of being very difficult to predict. And I think from Kirby Smart's standpoint, part of what you want here is not just for Robertson to be ruled eligible. Ultimately, Georgia got that. But maybe just as important as that is to have it done in a timely enough manner that you can kind of move on with your game planning. After all, when Jim Chaney spoke last Saturday, he talked about the fact that they were having to sort of treat Robertson, at least for the moment, as a guy they weren't sure was going to play for them here this season or not. Now that sort of changes the way that you practice with Robertson. I think that's also a big help for UGA. Here's a little bit more from Kirby Smart on discussing how these NCAA issues were navigated by the Georgia coach and the compliance staff helping him out.
I think when those other ones came through, like y'all mentioned, that you started to think, well, wouldn't that bear favorably upon us? But I think that would have been poor assumption because it just is going to be based on his appeal alone. I am happy that he's going to be able to get closer to his family and be able to play close to home.
Yeah, there's no other way to describe this, how Kirby Smart handles that situation. Like a veteran coach, navigating those waters beautifully is really cool. And if you dare me to say and allow me to say, it's really kind of cool under pressure, which brings us to a brand new feature we're going to do each week here on DawgNation Daily. It's called Cool Under Pressure. We're going to look at the Georgia coaches and players who perform well in a big spot, and we'll reward them here each week. And Kirby Smart's our first winner of the Cool Under Pressure designation, courtesy of our friends at RS Andrews, who remind you and invite you to keep cool no matter how hot it gets this summer with RS Andrews and their clean screen, trained, and timely techs who specialize in giving old systems new life. You call, they come, and then you're cool, period. It's as easy and simple as that. Now, if your old system has cooled its last, well, RS Andrews can also keep you covered with replacement air conditioning systems designed to last for you with available financing as well. So keep your cool. Call the ones that DawgNation trusts. RS Andrews online at rsandrews.com. It's great to have RS Andrews with us on the program. Great to have you with us as well. A lot more to get into on this subject and everything else going on with Georgia football. Is a busy scrimmage on Saturday. Let's cover more of that right now as welcome into Chip Towers here to DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Chip Towers. Great coverage of the Georgia scrimmage on Saturday. Really good stuff from Chip on that front. And, Chip, it certainly seemed like based on the post-game conversation or post-scrimmage conversation from Kirby Smart that the Robertson issue from Friday ends up kind of dwarfing everything that gets discussed on Saturday. But as I said before you joined us, this is a huge deal for Georgia. I think it's a missing piece potentially for the Georgia offense. And based on some of the stuff you wrote at DawgNation over the weekend, it sounds like you kind of agree with that as well.
Yeah, it is, BA. I mean, it's, Kirby, I would imagine at this point will, work to kind of downplay the whole thing because it did dominate the discussion. And part of that was, Kirby knowing we were going to be asking about it and then, and then us asking about it. So between the two things, I would say, D-Rob dominated at least half of the post-scrimmage conversation. Now, there was a lot of other work going on. That first scrimmage every fall, as they like to call it. They call it fall camp. I call it preseason camp. It's always a really critical one because this one really gets, kind of graded harshly, and they play a lot of guys. They rotate a lot of guys, and then they got to start eliminating, right? Georgia has a lot of good players on their roster, and Demetris Robertson's just one more of them. So you got to start feeling down. You got to get down to the core. So you can start, building your strategy for that first game and the first couple of games of the year. So it was a big scrimmage, and we're not going to be able to get much more detail on it until Tuesday because the players actually started class today. So Georgia has a completely off day, so those guys can get oriented and acclimated on their fall academic schedule. But D-Rob, there's nowhere to hide. He's going to be a big factor. And the fact of the matter, Brandon, now you and I have talked, I've always felt like Georgia's receiver corps might be a little bit better than a lot of people thought already. It got a whole lot better. And I'll tell you what, opposing secondary coaches and defensive coordinator, they really got a pick your poison situation when it comes to Georgia's receivers right now.
Well, let me piggyback off that point here for a moment. It comes to the Georgia receiving core and what might be required for Georgia to do the one step that it didn't take in 2017, which is winning the national championship. I was mentioning before you joined us, Chip, if you look at the 4 college football playoff national champions that have gone since 2014, all of them had at least one receiver that went over 900 yards receiving for the year. 2 of the 4 had guys that went over 1,000 yards. Georgia didn't have that last year. Javon Wims led the way at just north of 700 yards. What I suggested before you joined us is that if Georgia sort of joins that club of teams that produce a guy that goes over 900 yards receiving for a year, to me, Robertson's the more likely candidate, even in comparison to guys that have been here like Riley Ridley and Terry Godwin and McCole Hardman. He had better numbers as a freshman, even in an offense that threw the ball more than Georgia does. To me, Robertson just sort of feels like that guy. How does that land with you, comparing Robertson to the trio that's kind of already here and providing Georgia that vertical deep threat that it needs if it wants to win a national championship? Do you agree with me that Robertson's the most likely guy to provide that?
Yeah, maybe not, BA, because here's the thing. A lot of that's involved with this, I think, is chemistry and knowing the offense. There's so much that Georgia does in their throwing game, and their throwing game, they don't. Georgia is not. Now, I've said that I think Georgia's going to throw the ball more this year, and I don't think there's any question about that between Jake Fromm's development and the increased offensive weaponry in the wide receiver corps. But Georgia's still not going to sit there and throw the ball, every down. And they have so many different targets. They have so many mouths to feed. I just don't see one guy getting, the ball all the time, whether it's, D-Rob, we'll see how his talent translates. No question he has talent, but there's no question that it's different in the SEC than it was in the Pac-12. And then there's the matter of you got to learn that playbook. You got to know what's going on. There's a lot of read and react. There's a lot of hot reads and that kind of stuff. And, the fact of the matter is somebody is going to have to get single coverage in Georgia's setup. Depending on how D-Rob looks, that might not be him, right? I mean, it might be one of these other guys. So I just, if you're asking me like an over and under on, 900 yards receiving, for any one of Georgia's receivers, I'd take the under on that. But that's not because I don't think Georgia's going to throw the ball. I think it's because just what we're talking about. I think there's a lot of different weapons, a lot of different ways that Jim Chaney can have Jake Fromm go with the football. And I don't just think it's going to be one guy's number called all the time, like when they had Terrence Edwards, the only guy to ever have over 1,000 yards for Georgia, or when they had A.J. Green.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, Chip. I think that's a really fair sort of addendum to that conversation. Let me talk quarterbacks here for a moment. I thought you made an interesting statement at DawgNation the other day. In comparison to Fromm and Fields, you said and I'm going to paraphrase your words here, that for you this is still sort of a one-man quarterback competition right now, at least in terms of being the starter. I think I agree with you on that, but the one thing that I keep noticing in Kirby Smart's post-scrimmage comments on Saturday, another example of this, Kirby is not doing anything to sort of diminish the expectation for Fields. He seemingly was satisfied with both these guys again on Saturday. He comes across as a guy that's very comfortable if Justin Fields gets into play, or maybe it's better said when Justin Fields gets into play. Kirby's no doubt aware of the hype around Fields, and he's not doing too much about it right now, is he?
No, I mean, this serves Georgia well. I mean, he's going to be ready to play Justin Fields to whatever degree that Georgia can get him ready to play, because he has to, So I mean, I've said all along there's a plan for Justin Fields. There's no question to me, and I think we'll see him, and I think we'll probably see him a lot against Austin Peay, because we need to, right? I mean, we all need to see him. Everybody knows what people look like in practices and scrimmages and everything else, but it's always different on Saturday. I don't care if the competition is Austin Peay or South Carolina. It's a little bit different when they got those TV cameras on the zip line whipping across the field and the big cranes and all. I mean, it just changes the tone and complexity. And I haven't seen anything at all that makes me think that Justin Fields is not going to pass that test well. But yeah, for my money, and again, this is not any special insight. This is just, I guess, 35 years of observing football. And having watched Jake Fromm over 900 snaps for Georgia last year, when you get into SEC play, you're going to be leaning hard on Jake Fromm, and you're going to have a plan for Justin Fields and hope that he can carry it off in a game like that. But, yeah, it serves Kirby Smart and Justin Fields and the Georgia Bulldogs well to, at every opportunity to further the narrative of this is a competitive position just like every other one. I mean, it's like, Tyler Clark is competing with somebody at the three-technique tackle.
Right.
Nobody's going to beat Tyler Clark out, right? I mean, I don't think, based on what I saw last year. But, you got to keep that other guy motivated, and you got to put that guy in the game every once in a while. I see the same for Justin Fields as I do that three-technique defensive tackle.
So speaking as a fan, I'm not yet concerned about Terry Godwin, but we did talk about this last week, Chip, and it doesn't seem like the status has changed much over the course of 7 days here. Still, at least based on, I would imagine your visible eyewitness, a bit limited in practice, although Kirby Smart says he's doing more behind closed doors. What do you make of what's going on with Godwin here, and at what point in time does this go from being something that's not a deal at all to something that Georgia fans should be at least a little bit minorly concerned about?
Yeah, so I go back and forth on that. I mean, generally, I came out of this past weekend thinking, man, that's, maybe that's a little worse than we know. So there's one of two things going on here. One, either Godwin's knee injury is a little bit more significant than Kirby is letting on, or two, Terry is the type of guy. I mean, he knows this offense backwards and forward. He's been Georgia's primary receiver, primarily, for the last 3 years, certainly overall over the last 3 seasons. Nobody's played more snaps on the field with the offense than Terry Godwin has. So he knows it backwards and forward. So maybe it's, a situation like we had with DeAndre Swift in the spring where, could he have gone, with that groin injury? If it was in the season, yeah, probably so. But why risk it? But the reality is we don't really know. But then again, going back to D-Rob, I mean, D-Rob is probably going to play a lot at Terry's X position, I would imagine. And that's what's so intriguing about D-Rob. If you think about it, this is a guy who can play the X or the Y or the Z just as easily as he could any other position based on his, physical makeup and quickness. You can put him just about anywhere. And so that kind of, if you want to talk about D-Rob's impact, that right there is where it really makes a difference, is just depth. Because whether it's Riley that's out with an injury or McCole Hardman or somebody else that might not be 100%, just adding a guy like D-Rob to the core lets you know that, hey, we're going to be okay, right?
Yeah, that's really well said. One of the things I talked about on Friday's show, Chip, was something that Mel Tucker had said when he spoke to the media last Saturday, and it was about Tyson Campbell. And I know that cornerback is probably a very sneakily difficult position for a freshman to play well. I think it's a more cerebral position than some people realize, and making the transition from high school, where you just dominate everybody physically with your speed, to college, where other guys are fast too, and you have to sort of know where to go and know what you're doing. I think the fact that Tyson Campbell, at least according to what Mel Tucker said on Saturday, is sort of only practicing at cornerback right now, to me, I take that as potentially really good news for Georgia. And the reason why is, Chip, I think of cornerback as being one of these premium positions. The best teams have really good cornerbacks, much the same way offensive tackles. I also think about that being a bit of a premium position. I think it's a huge boost for Georgia if Campbell's a cornerback this year, because that's a spot where Georgia might be, despite the fact there are a lot of bodies practicing over there, that's a spot where Georgia might be a little thin. But if Campbell's good enough to play as a first-year guy, all of a sudden it doesn't seem quite so thin over there anymore. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And we're coming off a weekend in which Mark Webb was a little bit dinged up for one reason or another, wasn't able to go as much as they're hoping that he will. Yeah, Tyson Campbell's a big X factor in this defense overall. But you're right. I think the first point, Brandon, is it is cornerback and receiver can be very difficult to make the transition from high school to college. And the reason is, like Tyson Campbell, it's not hard to go on, any of the recruiting sites, or, Jeff Centel's, where I had several reports where, you're at these elite camps and you're sitting there lining up on somebody and covering them man to man. Tyson Campbell's great at that. All these guys coming out of high school are great at that. The fact of the matter is, you're rarely asked to do that a whole lot on the college level. And even in high school, when you're playing a lot of zone, I mean, basically a guy with the talent level of like Tyson Campbell or anybody who could be recruited to Georgia, you're going to put him in, back there on the back line and basically, or put him in the center of the field and tell him, hey, follow the ball, patrol the whole thing. But it gets very, very specific. Sometimes you got man on one side and you got zone go on the other. You got a zone underneath and you've got a specific zone, or you switch out of zone into triple coverage and in triple zones. I mean, there's all kinds of different alignments that you got to be thinking of, and your responsibilities change according to what gets audibled in sometimes, from Mel Tucker on the sideline. So it's just not as simple as line up on that guy and cover it. If it was, I think Tyson Campbell would have a very, very easy time with it, and I think he is anyway. I mean, talent is talent, but it takes a minute to get acclimated to all that stuff, and that's why you see a lot of guys. I mean, I think guys like Tyreek McGee and some guys who've already taken a lot of reps on the field are going to probably field a lot of those reps early part of the year, and then those younger guys can work their way in eventually.
And let me follow up on Mark Webb, who you mentioned a moment ago, and I'm glad you brought him up, because it seems like this experiment is over. If he's healthy, he's just it sounds like cornerback's the position for him as well. Just a good defensive back and likely a good cornerback. He was praised last year for how he practiced. It seems like, if he's fully healthy, I mean, he's maybe a starter at the other cornerback position. Is that kind of what you're sort of leaning towards right now?
Yeah, I mean, he's who I've got penciled in at my depth chart. You know how Kirby is about depth charts. He doesn't produce one. He said, y'all got one, and I got one. And that's, I've got Mark Webb over at that position right now. But, if you look at him physically, he's everything that Mel Tucker is looking for in a cornerback. 6'1", 200 pounds, a lot of speed, and apparently you hear about the hips and all that. That's what he has is so natural, is that hip swivel that you need at that position. Now, you got DeAndre Baker on the other side, so whoever plays this position, I think DeAndre ends up generally on the field side. So you need somebody who can stand up and be tough against the run on the short side of the field, and Mark Webb looks like a perfect fit in that regard.
With this, Chip, let me finish up with this if you don't mind. I thought you wrote something kind of interesting the other day. You were kind of cataloging some of your early thoughts about practice, and you mentioned a thought on the Georgia defensive line that maybe some depth concerns that you at one point in time had with this group after seeing a little bit of practice. All of a sudden, that doesn't quite seem as significant to you anymore. I was hoping you might expound upon that a bit more.
Yeah, overall, BA, I'm starting to really warm up to this defense a little bit, and I don't know, maybe I'm just getting caught up in the excitement of the season or what have you. But, I mean, I do think Jay Hayes made a huge difference, not just because he comes in there and he's able to play that tackle position right out of the box, but because he's the consummate putty guy. You can move him around and put him in a lot of play. And it just seems like there's a lot more depth than I gave it account for. I accounted for. And when you look out there and you look at the guys, Julian Rochester played a lot of ball. Daquan Hawkins-Muckle played a lot of ball. They're really excited about Jordan Davis at the nose, and apparently Devontae Wyatt is comporting himself well. And I really like Georgia's front line. I mean, when you talk about Jonathan Ledbetter and Tyler Clark, those guys are solid out there, as well as their backups. Like David Marshall and Malik Herring. So I don't know. I just the more I look at it, I'm starting to like it better. Now, the linebacker remains a very intriguing position to me, because if you look at Georgia right now, they're going with Tay Crowder and Natrez Patrick a lot with the ones, it appears. Those guys are 6'3", 235, 6'3", and 240. If they're playing together, that's a markedly different look than you had last year with Roquan Smith and Reggie Carter in there playing a lot at the linebacker spot. So I don't know if they got a jumbo versus a Swift package, where they have where they have Jawan Taylor and the other guys going in there, Monty Rice, going in there with the other one, or they mix and match those four. But because of what I'm just feeling a lot better about Georgia's front seven overall. And, I think that bodes well for Georgia going into the season. I really do.
Yeah, Chip, that's really interesting. And we've loved reading everything from you over the last few days here at DawgNation.com. I know you've got some great stuff planned in the days ahead. We appreciate you being with us here today on Dog Nation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, and we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
See you next time.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Really quickly here, a couple of very interesting things that Chip had to say there. First of all, he mentions the linebackers, and that's something else that he had written the other day, which I think we're going to at some point in time have to dive into a little bit more. The choices that Georgia can make with its linebacking core here. Now, we assume that Natrez Patrick is just going to be on the field a lot here. That's a guy that probably, occupies a lot of playing time in the middle of that Georgia defense. But can you do something different with, a bigger linebacker like Tay Crowder, or maybe smaller, maybe somewhat speedier guys like Monty Rice and Nate McBride, who was, I guess, a bit injured on over the weekend. But you can make some different choices there with your personnel and your linebacking core. Chip did a pretty good job of writing about that. I thought that was really interesting. Something else that Chip mentioned there was how Jay Hayes, the transfer from Notre Dame, sort of changes the calculus for the Georgia defensive line. We're going to look more at Jay Hayes later on our program as part of our Own the East series here by Georgia's own credit union. Chip wrote a great piece on Hayes. You can read it at DawgNation.com. Also contributed to our video, which we're going to show you, or if you're listening to us, you'll be able to hear that coming up in a moment. Good stuff. A deeper look here at Jay Hayes. Let me, for now, though, talk about the rest of the SEC. Let's do our SEC through. Let me start with the situation in Florida. Edgar Thompson covers the Gators for the Orlando Sentinel. He had mentioned something over the weekend that kind of got my attention. that apparently early on in the media availability for practice on Saturday, Felipe Franks was struggling for Florida, and Thompson tweeted out that Kyle Trask wasn't doing much better. Now, over the course of the day, the coverage did somewhat change. Eventually, you had, a lot of reporters saying that Felipe Franks ended up looking the best of all the quarterbacks. But I think here's an important takeaway here. When you're watching, sort of practice coverage from teams and a player's praise, listen carefully here. Is this praise in comparison to the rest of his teammates or in comparison to sort of the high championship standard? And it sounds like Felipe Franks is being praised and complimented in comparison to the rest of his Florida teammates, which is the point that I made a lot during the offseason, that Florida's quarterback situation is a mess because we know how good Felipe Franks is. We saw him last year, and obviously there'll be a little bit of maturity that you expect from one year to the next. He'll be a little bit better in 2018 than he was in 2017. But we saw with our own eyes how good he is, or, if you're a Florida fan, unfortunately, how not good that he is. And apparently, after spring practice and the early going of summer practice here, it doesn't sound like Kyle Trask is better, and some Florida fans hope that he would be. And some Florida fans sort of held out hope that the freshman potential phenom, Emory Jones, one of the centerpieces of Dan Mullen's 2018 signing class, that he might swoop in and save the day. Doesn't sound like that's close to happening right now. Florida's offense may belong once again here to Felipe Franks. I think that's good news for Florida's SEC rivals, but maybe not necessarily good for the Gators. That'll be a story worth monitoring and watching here. And speaking of Florida, they have kind of gotten mixed up a little bit into this Urban Meyer fiasco that's been going on at Ohio State. You by now know that. Meyer's on administrative leave. It looks like we may be trending back in a direction where Meyer returns as an Ohio State coach here, but there's still a lot of questions about how he handled the Zach Smith situation, the now ousted Ohio State wide receivers coach. And some of this stems back from 2009 when Smith worked for Urban Meyer there at Florida. Meyer said that he handled proper protocol when he was there at Gainesville. Well, former Florida Athletic Director Jeremy Foley was asked about that, and Foley sort of declined comment on that, which, is certainly Foley's right to do, not to go down that road whatsoever, but it's going to sort of raise more questions about what did indeed happen with Urban Meyer in Florida back in 2009. And obviously, I'm not in a position to comment on that, to explain the 2009 situation any more than I can comment and explain the 2017 situation, 2018 situation, or I guess the alleged incident that occurred in 2015. I think there's a lot bubbling below the surface of this Urban Meyer deal that we do not yet know, including the weird, conflicting text messages released by Brett McMurphy, and then also, what comes out from Courtney Smith's mom, which is the person that was quoted by the Ohio State reporter here. This is a really weird situation. It's kind of funny to watch other programs kind of get mixed into it, whether it be Florida via Jeremy Foley, Texas via Tom Herman. You may have seen that come out over the weekend. This is a really, really strange situation here. I mentioned that Jeremy Foley declined comment. That's maybe something that South Carolina coach Will Muschamp should have done when he was asked about another controversy sort of bubbling up in College Park, Maryland, with the University of Maryland and Muschamp's former assistant, DJ Durkin, who's the head coach there. The stuff at Maryland is sort of outside the boundaries of what we typically talk about on DawgNation Daily, but you can certainly read about that. That is an ugly, ugly case. If the allegations prove to be true, it's a really bad deal for the Terrapins there. Muschamp came out critical of the quote-unquote anonymous sources that were used to initially bring the topic to light. This, once again, seems like a scenario in which Muschamp, who's got his own stuff to worry about there at South Carolina in terms of living up to what Gamecocks fans want this year to be, maybe there's a different time and a place to sort of come to the aid of your former assistant and give him some public cover here, because to even get mixed up in a situation like this, where right now the early allegations seem really, really ugly, this would appear to be a case of Muschamp being drawn off sides on a topic that he probably should have just completely ignored to begin with there. Let me give you one more quick story here as a part of our SEC Through. Our buddy Mike Griffith is heavily involved with the Football Writers Association of America. In fact, he's the reigning FWAA Sports Writer of the Year, and Mike let us know that the FWAA's got a brand new award coming out here in 2018 for the first time ever. The Football Writers Association of America is going to honor the nation's top freshmen. So this should be a fun award to track over the course of the season, and certainly plenty of Georgia freshmen from the nation's #1 class 2018 will have a chance to win that award here at the season's end. So good stuff there. We'll make that your SEC Through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, It's been fun to dive a little deeper and look a little more closely at what Georgia's going to need to do if it wants to take the steps that it took in 2017, starting with winning the division once again, owning the East, as we like to say around here, and no doubt one of the significant contributors to that cause will be the Notre Dame graduate transfer, Jay Hayes, who could be doing big things to the Georgia defensive line here this season. Let's learn a little bit more about him right now. Georgia's own credit union presents Own the East, and look at the names to know as the Dogs try to get back on top of the division once again here in 2018. Hello, everybody. I'm Brandon Adams, along with DawgNation's Chip Towers. Chip, I think we would agree that defensive line position may be one of the Dogs' biggest positions of needs here in 2018, and one of the things that Kirby Smart has done is reach the graduate transfer route to bring in Jay Hayes from Notre Dame. My assumption is that Hayes plays a big role for UGA this season. Would you agree?
I think that's a pretty good assumption there, Brandon. Yeah, absolutely. Georgia needs Jay Hayes to play right away, and I don't see anything from his background that tells me that he's not going to play and play a lot. He's going to figure immediately in Georgia's rotation. Jay Hayes, in case you haven't heard, is a guy who started for Notre Dame, started against Georgia last year. I think he might have had 6, 7, 8 tackles against the Bulldogs in South Bend. And he's going to come in here to Athens and immediately need to shore up depth. Depth is a real, very big concern for Georgia, like it hadn't had in the last couple of years on the defensive line. And it seems like Kirby every year seems to pull off some kind of late transfer, going back to Bo Smith, and then certainly J.R. Reed has turned out to be quite an acquisition. And just add Jay Hayes to the resume, and if he does like those other guys do, then he'll have a great year.
And at Hayes' position in particular along the defensive line, this is one of the areas in which Kirby Smart's probably been the most candid. Go back to the spring. He talked a lot about the fact that he did not think that group was physical enough against a very good Georgia offensive line during practice. That's what Jay Hayes is being brought in to correct, right?
Well, that's exactly what he's being brought in for. And I can't profess to have watched a whole bunch of Jay Hayes tape at this point, but what I did do was follow Jay Hayes a little bit on a walk through Camp Sunshine, and I tell you, wearing number 97 this year, he's much bigger than I anticipated him being, and I think he's going to fit in that role very well.
Yeah, we'll see how Jay Hayes impacts the Georgia defense here in 2018. On the East is brought to you by Georgia's own credit union and Georgia's own Visa Signature Card, which gives 1.25 points for each dollar charged and can be redeemed for cashback, gift cards, travel, merchandise, and more. Check out georgiasown.org for more details. It really continues to be one of my favorite things about Kirby Smart as Georgia coach, and, we've had a lot of fun with this during our last few off seasons here on our DawgNation Daily even, that, Smart just adds guys sort of post-signing day that end up making big contributions to Georgia. You've heard me make this comparison before. It's like a waiver wire acquisition. Like many of you manage your fantasy football teams, Smart is great at those sort of waiver wire acquisitions for college football as well. I think that Jay Hayes is going to be a true name to know here this season. I think he's going to make, assuming he's healthy, I think he's a big part of the Georgia defensive line. Demetris Robertson off the top of the show, he is very much the same way. These are sort of non-traditional avenues in which Smart explores here on a roster that's already talented. He's looking to make it as talented as he possibly can. He's looking to maximize those 85 available scholarships. And in a day and age in which the balance of talent has never been more imbalanced in favor of just a couple of teams. Teams like I mentioned earlier, like Clemson and Alabama and Ohio State. You've got to build a roster just as strong as those programs have, and Kirby Smart's done a really good job of doing just that. All right, so really fun stuff there, and always fun to think about our Gatorator Countdown. We love to close the show this way each and every day, and we'll remind you that there are 75 days before Georgia goes back to Jacksonville for the world's largest outdoor cocktail party and beats those lousy, stinking Gators once again. We'll do our Gatorator Countdown for you each and every day right here on a DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. It's also been kind of cool for me to see a lot of you will sort of share with me on Twitter your various license plates and things like that, and I retweeted some of this over the weekend. A Gatorator license plate from Wisconsin, one from California. It's kind of cool to see just how much Gator hating is sort of spread across the nation here. Some of you have taken pictures of your Gatorator t-shirt across the world there too. I always like seeing that kind of stuff. It's always a lot of fun to get excited about what I think of as Georgia's biggest rival. Really good stuff at DawgNation. Check it out from the scrimmage on Saturday. Read that. We'll come back, talk more about it tomorrow, and we'll see you right here on DawgNation Daily. And for those of you on video. So come to find out, whatever issue we had with YouTube seems to have miraculously sort of dissolved into the ether. It would appear that we are all good to go there on YouTube. So hopefully some of you figured that out and found your way over there. In fact, let's see if anybody's actually checking us out on YouTube after all that was said and done. Yeah, we got a few folks over there on the YouTube side. Good to see, and including Bo Kaifas, who says the Gators are just so easy to hate. Yeah, listen, there's no doubt about that. Kevin Blackman says no issue on YouTube. Good to know, Kevin. Glad y'all are all good to go on that. I apologize for the suggestion otherwise. Let me get some. By the way, let me also remind you about this while we're here. We got a big event coming up on August 23rd. It's our DawgNation season kickoff. We're getting very close to it. 6 p.m. coming up on August the 23rd. There at the brand new Kroger Marketplace in Cumming. Really looking forward to that. It's going to be awesome. Jeff and I are going to be there. Some of the Athens guys are hopefully going to have a chance to be there as well, depending on what the Georgia practice schedule looks like for that particular week. We're going to have some stuff to give away. We'll have a very special off-air Q&A. It's going to be a lot of fun. We are really excited about doing the DawgNation season kickoff coming up on August the 23rd, so I hope you can make plans to be with us and be a part of all of that. Alan Verbanchik says even with Demetris Robertson's speed, he's still not the fastest player on the team. Is Campbell, is he the fastest? Is he going to clock the fastest 40 of anybody? Or maybe it's maybe a 100-meter dash might be the better way to judge that. Is Campbell the fastest 100-meter guy on the team? That'd probably be a pretty good race. Chip Gromlich says Durkin coached with Meyer at Bowling Green and at Florida. Yeah, that's right. They do have that tie in there together. Now, both those programs sort of dealing with kind of an ugly issue here. Let me get Matt Rukavina's comment, who says, BA, what do you think about boy, these comments come in fast here. He says, what do you think about a tailgate up in Helen, Georgia, only 90 minutes away from Athens? First of all, I love Helen. I think it's a beautiful town. And getting up there and doing an event, I think it'd be a lot of fun. Jeff and I have done a couple things now sort of outside the boundaries of the sort of typical, Atlanta area. We're going to do a lot more of that stuff here coming up very soon. So I'd love to put Helen on the docket there for DawgNation. I think that'd be really fun. Will Puckett says, I have no concerns with Tyson Campbell or any of our secondary. The best receivers they're going to face will be every day on the practice field. Iron sharpens iron. If they can hang with our wideouts, they can hang with anybody in the country. Well, I certainly love that sentiment. I will caution, though, in one regard, though. I think that one of the things that Georgia is likely to deal with in some of its toughest games this season is a pretty good receiving corps. For instance, I think that Georgia matches up very well with South Carolina at most sort of, competing position groups. But the one challenge that South Carolina does pose to a team like Georgia is its wide receivers. Deebo Samuel, I believe, is going to be, a potential top 10 pick in the NFL draft. Not only is he lethal as a return man, but he's also a very good wide receiver. And his counterpart on the other side, Brian Edwards, is also very good. Is South Carolina going to miss a little bit, no longer having Hayden Hurst, the tight end? Maybe that's probably true. But those receivers for South Carolina are still pretty good. I think the LSU wide receiver corps, now stop me if you've heard this before, LSU seemingly always has a good receiving corps. I think LSU's receiving corps is going to be very good. Jonathan Giles is the Texas Tech transfer. The freshman Jamar Chase has already been praised during some of the early practices from LSU. Terrace Marshall's a former 5-star from the 2018 signing class. That group for LSU is really good. I don't quite yet know about the Auburn guys as much. I think that Stidham's a good quarterback. I just don't know about those receivers necessarily. I think the Florida receivers are probably pretty good. Van Jefferson's eligible now. Tyree Cleveland's a bit of a known commodity. So one of the things that Georgia will deal with are good receivers. Now, Georgia, from a talent standpoint, overwhelms virtually everybody it will play, but there are some challenging receiving cores that Georgia has to face. So the secondary will be sort of, called into action a good bit this season, I'm guessing. Let me pop over to YouTube, and we'll get some more Facebook comments in a moment. 98 Sports Talk, thanks for checking in today. Chad Dewberry says, any bus going to the LSU game? I live in Kentucky. So I don't know about buses going to the game all the way from Kentucky. I do know that we can tell you more about some really exciting stuff we have coming up around the LSU game as we get a little bit closer to that. Al Clements asking about injuries that could keep somebody away from playing from South Carolina. So we'll probably update some of this stuff as we head through the week, but it sounds like Nate McBride was a little bit banged up here this weekend. Terry Godwin still a little bit slowed by whatever he's dealing with. I want to be careful about, making sure I don't either leave anything out or mention something that wasn't get my wires crossed here. Yeah, so we'll update some more of that throughout the week. But I do know that Kirby mentioned McBride on. Oh yeah, Kyrus Jackson is another guy that I guess has been a little bit set back by injury here for a moment. And Kirby said he's been practicing pretty well, so he said it was a little bit disappointing to see him kind of set back there. The one thing I like about Kyrus Jackson is, Jackson's like this big, he looks different than, I'm assuming Jackson will play as a slot receiver for Georgia. He looks a little bit different than some slot receivers you may have seen in the past. He's well north of 200 pounds. This is a big, thick guy now. He's a pretty interesting little weapon there in the middle of the field because, I sort of picture him because he's so strong seemingly already. He's going to like post up some of those guys inside when he plays. He's a very interesting looking guy, but it sounds like Jackson's a little bit hobbled at the moment. Kevin Blackman says, what about the T-shirts, BA? Yes, we are desperately behind on our DawgNation retaliation T-shirts, and I have very little in the way of excuse on that. I apologize. Shane Bentley says, I've seen a lot of hype around South Carolina going into the season. Some reporters are actually picking them to win the division. I can't wait for UGA to showcase why they will win the SEC. Shane, I for the most part agree with what you're saying there. In comparison to Georgia, I don't think the South Carolina roster is very strong. I think in a close game, based on bad luck or, a funny bouncing ball, something along those lines, I think the South Carolina receivers can be dangerous, but overall, the Georgia roster is much stronger than the Gamecocks at virtually all the positions that really matter. That's very fair. Bo Kaifas also mentioning some long throws from Drew Lock and the receivers there at Missouri. Yeah, that's true. Now, some of the receivers you may have seen do a little damage to UGA last year, guys like Jamon Moore, they are gone. Moore in particular is gone there from Missouri, but we know that Lock's going to be throwing the ball, and somebody's going to emerge as a target there. Ty Middlebrook says, I'm not worried about the South Carolina receivers because they don't have a run game. I can't deny that. That is something that Muschamp has not really established too much of yet. Wayne Folan says he's still waiting for his T-shirt. Yeah, Wayne, I am sorry about that. Spoonie Jr. says, want to hear about how Richard LeCounte's coming along. He's got some big shoes to fill. I know that Mike Griffith wrote about that the other day at DawgNation.com, and both Kirby and Mel Tucker have spoken about that when they've met with the media here. Obviously, I think that there's a big circle around Richard LeCounte's name because he's going to be asked to step in and be a big contributor for the Georgia defense. When we talk about unknown commodities for Georgia's secondary right now, we do address the star position because we don't know yet who's going to be starting there, and it sounds like Georgia may use a combination of guys, somebody on like, say, first and second down and a very different kind of player maybe on third down. And then there's the other cornerback position, which, based on what Chip Tower said a moment ago, may be filled by a converted wide receiver. So there is still a bit of a work in progress going on here with this Georgia secondary, which puts, I believe, added emphasis on Richard LeCounte's role with this team. He needs to be a solid starter. Now, kind of what I've heard on LeCounte is this is a guy who's sort of gives you both ends of the spectrum. The kind of plays that make you say wow, and the kind of plays that make you say huh. He kind of gives you a bit of both of those, which is sort of be expected by a still relatively young defensive back. Overall, I'm pretty confident in what I believe that LeCounte's eventually going to provide to UGA. Because if you want to go back to his 2017 recruiting year, not only do we see him show some leadership chops with that class, we also saw some sort of highlight reel moments from some of the All-Star games and things like that, where he showed that real tenacity that you're going to need to play in Kirby Smart's defense. Ultimately, I feel pretty good about where Richard LeCounte's eventually going to land, but eventually is a key word there. That he's got to work his way into that spot and work his way up the ladder there in terms of defensive names you can trust. And I think it's going to be a fun storyline to watch play out. Tony McCart says, will we see more of Elijah Holyfield? Kirby did reference a long run for Holyfield in the scrimmage on Saturday, so I think that Holyfield, especially early in the season, is going to have a big role, and then at that point in time, you have to see what the pecking order becomes. We assume that a healthy DeAndre Swift gets the most carries. The number 2 spot is open. I eventually think that's going to be taken by a healthy Zamir White. So then it's Harry and it's Holyfield, it's the freshman James Cook sort of battling for that 3rd spot, because they should be a pretty big drop-off between the number 3 guy and the number 4 guy in terms of total carries. So Holyfield's got an opportunity here to either beat out one of the 2 freshmen and stand there alongside DeAndre Swift, or at least be one of the guys that's in the heavy regular rotation. And that's a deep conversation. Santiago Diarn's excited about the season starting because of all the talent that Georgia has. Yeah, listen, I'm right there with you, Santiago, on that. I totally agree with you on that. Alan Verbanchik reminds us we're getting ready for the DJ Daniel decision on Thursday. Yeah, DawgNation going to have live coverage of that coming up on Thursday as well. I'm really looking forward to being a part of that. Rhett Proctor says, do you think James Cook will play? Rhett, I would have assumed that, just based on the fact that he's a freshman, that he might have been the most likely of the five to sort of find his way on the outside looking in, at least for this first season. Although now, given the fact that he's been sort of warmly received by some of the Georgia coaches and complimented by some of the reporters who are there in Athens every single day, all of a sudden now I guess I'm going to sort of back off that point here a moment and start to wonder if there isn't a chance that Cook, another freshman, could also beat out the guys who've been there a little bit longer, guys like Brian Herring and Elisha Holyfield. Should be very interesting to see. Junior Baker says, who's going to be the next big commit to DawgNation? Junior, I guess it all comes down to what your definition of big is. Does DJ Daniel qualify as a big in that regard? Because on Thursday, I think a lot of people feel good about the Daniel choice. Of course, Georgia is one of three finalists for Daniel there, but obviously there is a degree of optimism here because of, in the DJ Daniel interview we played for you Before the Hedges last week, I think was a good example of this in terms of what Georgia likes about Daniel and what Daniel likes about Georgia. But certainly seems like there's some growing momentum for some other prospects here as well. We got to get ready to get out of here. Jason Bryan Lee says, do you think when Kirby talks to the media about some of the top players needing work, he's trying to motivate the player more than degrading their performance? Absolutely, Jason Bryan Lee. I absolutely believe that's true. I think that Kirby Smart probably does not enjoy speaking to the media. We don't have to guess to come up with that opinion. But since he's got to do it, he's going to use it to his advantage, and communicating is something that he likes to do. I think I also wouldn't put it past him to occasionally send a subliminal message to future recruits there in that regard as well. I think that Kirby Smart's very aware that shows like this one sort of hang on his every word. We're going to listen, we're going to parse them closely, and we're going to broadcast them very loudly. And so it's his chance to sort of put whatever message into the universe he wants to put, whether it be what he wants his current team to look like or, that sort of beckoning to future recruits. I think that Kirby Smart's very good at using that to his advantage. Very good at using that to his advantage. All right, let me try to get one more, and we'll get ready to get out of here. Jay Wise looking for parking for the Georgia-Florida game. Hopefully we'll have a nice setup again this year for that like we've had before. Nick Lurch says he thinks that Kirby Smart's going to use all his tools just to keep offenses off balance. Yeah, I mean, that's always the one thing about the offseason conversation is, even in a year like this, much like last year where you said, gosh, there are all these weapons at tight end, there are all these weapons at running back, there are all these weapons at wide receiver, and yet there is still only one football, and Georgia is going to be a team that still only runs the ball, or I should say, Georgia's not going to be one of these 100-play-a-game offenses. Someone's not going to get as many touches, as much productivity as we hope that they do. It won't be fantasy football for every single one of these guys out there. But as the commenter Nick Lurch pointed out, the threat of these guys makes the offense very dangerous. Knowing that Werner or Nod is on the field, even if they're not catching the football, is something opposing defenses have to think about. Knowing that speedy vertical threats exist in the wide receiver core makes it that much tougher to stop the run. I think that Georgia is going to be a very difficult team to practice against because I do think that you're going to have to put a lot of effort towards stopping something you may or may not see. In a given game, Georgia may or may not throw deep very much. But if they do against single coverage, it could be lethal because of the fact that, safeties are worried about that collection of running backs up front. I would not want to be a defensive coordinator tasked with stopping UGA. Now, college football has a way of not working out quite as simply as you want it to, but certainly it's going to be some very, very strenuous and stressful practices for some of Georgia's competition here this season. Over on YouTube, let me get one final comment. Shane Bentley, appreciate the kind words. Al Clement says when you're looking at those recruiting rankings, look at the per-player average. I would sort of agree with Al on that, and yet I also kind of agree with Kevin Blackman that that it's still fun to have the number one class. I just think it's cool to take something that Alabama wants, and I just think there's just a little bit of prestige in being number one in anything, even if ultimately there's not that great of a difference between number one and number two, or number one and number three. It's just still fun to be number one, and that may be where Georgia gets by the time the 2019 cycle is over with. We'll have a lot of coverage of that for you this week, Wednesday at 3 p.m. in the afternoon for Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger. Special DawgNation Before the Hedges recruiting special Thursday night to take a look at DJ Daniels' announcement, the junior college cornerback there from Georgia Military College. We'll be all over that. And then back live tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. We'll also have the podcast version of this show up and running for you here on all the various podcast channels very, very soon. And what else? Oh, yeah, DN90 coming up today on the DawgNation video channels as well. Make sure you check that out as we take you around DawgNation. All the news you need to know in 90 seconds. We'll do that for you on DN90 later on today. Y'all have a great day. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily Live, presented by Marco's Pizza.